Well, good morning, and thank you for being here with Senator Turner, Nancy Neylon of the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, and myself. We are so pleased to announce the introduction of a very important piece of legislation designed to help victims of domestic violence. The Address Confidentiality program will make sure that people who have suffered abuse, stalking, and harassment and have taken the hard step to relocate will not have to relive that nightmare because their abuser found their address in the public record. They won't have to worry that they registered to vote or that they filled out an application for public employment or enrolled their children in public schools, all of which require the disclosure of a home address and all of which are discoverable in the public record. Domestic violence is too big a problem to ignore. It touches too many lives. The recent national conversation about domestic violence tells us something important about the nature of this problem. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It devastates everyone, from those in the national spotlight down to the people we know in our own neighborhoods and communities. Our sisters, mothers, aunts, colleagues, and friends. We've been talking as a nation about why people stay in domestic violence situations. On Twitter and Facebook, women have been sharing their stories using the hashtag #WhyIStayed and why I left. Many highlight the fear of retaliation by their abuser for leaving, of being without resources, of being disconnected from their communities when they leave, of having to start over while being haunted by the fear of being found by their abuser. Abusers sometimes take steps to trap their victims or retaliate. The logic behind our bill is simple. People who are brave enough to leave a violent situation and come forward to seek assistance deserve the full support of their state as they rebuild their lives. Part of that means helping them shield their location information once they've left their violent situation. When this bill was introduced in the 128th General Assembly, it received a unanimous vote on the House floor, but was never brought to a vote in the Senate. It was stalled again in the 129th General Assembly. This is a bill that has overwhelming support because it makes sense. We ought to be advancing measures to protect our state's most vulnerable citizens. Senator Turner and I are introducing it again in the House and Senate and are determined to see it move forward. Ohio's domestic violence survivors are depending on us. This bill presents a common-sense, low-cost measure following in the footsteps of 37 other states that have successfully implemented similar programs. Domestic violence is a community problem that demands community solutions. As a state, we should be doing all we can to ensure the safety of people taking the hard and dangerous step of leaving domestic violence situations. Protecting their location is one way of doing that. And now I'll turn it over to Senator Turner.
Thank you, Representative Clyde, and good morning to everyone. One of the greatest fears of survivors of domestic violence, stalking, and harassment is that their abuser will find them again. The Address Confidentiality Program, or the ACP, would enact safeguards to make it harder for an address to be discovered, providing the much-needed privacy and protection to those whose lives depend on it. So who can apply? Individuals and their children who can attest to threats against their safety following incidents of abuse, stalking, or harassment. A trained and certified application assistant would walk the individual through the process of enrolling in the program. The program works in this way. An individual would get to use a placeholder mailing address, aka their ACP address. This is the address they can use for all mail correspondence and interactions with any government agency and the United States Postal Service. All participants' first-class mail will be sent to this ACP address, which will be managed by the Secretary of State's office and then forwarded to the participant. This bill is certainly important, as Representative Clyde has laid out, and it would allow the victims, folks who find themselves in these circumstances, to participate and to be civically engaged and not fear that. The ACP would allow victims to continue to engage in their full rights and responsibilities of citizenship, including voting. For all elections-related materials, including absentee ballots, the participant will use their ACP address. Current Ohio law mandates that the addresses of registered voters be accessible in the public record, but the ACP would provide an exemption for those enrolled, a further safeguard against an address falling into the wrong hands. I want to share with you some real-world examples from across the country and even in our state. A woman named Janet in Colorado, who testified in court in an attempted murder case, concealed her voter registration due to fear for her safety after the accused vowed to find her and kill her. She had not registered to vote in 15 years and avoided letting her address enter into the public record until she was able to enroll in Colorado's ACP program. For years, Virginia resident Hannah endured verbal and physical abuse from her husband until they officially separated. After their divorce was finalized and Hannah had moved away, her ex-husband threatened to kill her when he found her. Her ex-husband later found her kicking in the door. She and her daughters fled and went into hiding for 5 months before moving to Florida. Her enrollment in Florida's ACP program has allowed her to send her children to school, apply for public jobs, and to start her life over. In Ohio, a woman named Katie became a victim of stalking while in college. A stranger followed her home and broke into her mailbox to get her name. After calling and harassing her, the assailant showed up at her apartment at night, broke in, and kidnapped her at gunpoint. He was later arrested and was released from prison 7 years later. Katie spent much of the time following his release in fear, learning to hide from her stalker who had promised he would track her down. No one should have to live in that type of fear, and it really is incumbent upon those of us who serve a public service to do everything that we can to help women who find themselves in this situation. The ACP would help Katie and many other women like her in Ohio to live their life without the constant fear that their attacker would find out where they are. It is time for us to act and join the 37 other states that have already implemented a program like this. Based on ACP programs in other states, we estimate that about 350 Ohioans will enroll in the program at first, with small growth. This is not a large program. It is not for everyone. It is for those extreme, dangerous cases where a victim feels her only choice is to hide, but she still wants to be engaged in public life and exercise her fundamental right to vote. I now want to turn the microphone over to Executive Director Nancy Neylon of the Ohio Domestic Violence Network.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning. The Ohio Domestic Violence Network fully supports this legislation to enact an address confidentiality program to protect the confidential locations of victims of violence. We've been working on this for a long time. The bill was first introduced in this state by former Governor Taft when he was Secretary of State. So you can think about how many years ago that was. We're still trying to get this done. Domestic violence is an insidious crime with very complex dynamics. As advocates, we have seen victims who have experienced domestic violence along a continuum of abuse. They've all experienced trauma. All of the violence they experience is not lethal. But a victim who needs a confidential address has likely moved very many times to try and escape her abuser. And in order to make this address confidentiality program effective, she's got to move. She's got to have a new place to live. And make other significant changes in her life. Again, maybe perhaps giving up her job, giving up visits with friends or families, giving up her own faith community in order to keep herself safe. Domestic violence is not an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of events that is really designed to maintain control over somebody. It includes not just physical acts of violence, but also psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial control. Stalking involves repeated harassment of somebody at their workplace, at their home, at their parents' home. Stalking is frequently something that happens when a victim tries to leave a relationship. Leaving a relationship is not as easy as the words suggest. Why does she stay? I mean, we recently had that in the news, and why did I stay, in terms of that discussion. The most dangerous time for victims is when they leave a situation, and that's because the perpetrator will do everything that they can to maintain control. That's the time when violence, physical violence, is likely to increase. That's the time of greatest lethality for victims. When batterers believe they are losing control of a relationship, when stalkers believe that they can't maintain control, that's when they will escalate their violence. And they'll go to unimaginable lengths. I mean, you can't even imagine. 500 texts a day, 500 phone calls a day, tracking through GPS systems, tracking through computers, tracking with devices on cars, notes left in your mailbox all the time. I'm reminded of the woman in Dayton whose ex-husband left flowers on her doorstep every day for weeks until he showed up with a knife and slit his throat. So the methods that they use to track somebody and to keep control over somebody are really relentless. So the Address Confidentiality Program is really designed to alleviate that. Again, it's not for every victim. And again, not all victims experience this sort of control that could potentially rise to some kind of lethality. But it's what the Address Confidentiality Program does, it allows victims to be able to have an address that government officials can use if they need to be found for some reason, that they're available, so they're not in hiding. And I think that's a really excellent thing, as well as, of course, being able to vote and being able to be part of the public life that way. Safety planning is a huge part of what advocates do with victims, and again, this would be a part of that safety planning process to see if it was necessary or needed for victims of domestic violence. And again, we have mentioned that it's already been established in 37 states across the country. I've spoken to many domestic violence coalitions as well as address confidentiality programs. They assure me that the number of applicants is not huge, as Senator Turner already mentioned, and the cost has been minimal. And so we may never know if there's no life that's been saved or a serious injury that's been avoided, but certainly I think the possibility of that is reason enough to move forward at this time. Thank you.